So me and Carl have been working on getting like our membership with the Community Devs program for Google. So we're both signed up for that. And as part of that deal, one, it connects you with like different resources in terms of like speakers and things like that. And then two, it also gives you free membership for a free Meetup Pro membership for the year. So we're working on getting all that set up. And eventually we'd like to maybe change the format a little bit to where we have like a guest speaker, either virtually or in person, like once a week, or not once a week, sorry, once a meeting, something like that. We'll probably be virtual for at least this month and next month. But just kind of go away from, or at least we probably will still have sort of the study guide format that we've been having, but then kind of adding to it as well, extending it a little bit to where we have like people coming in and talking about, important things. So if there are any speakers any people that you are interested in hearing from, definitely, send that information in the Slack channel, and we'll go through the effort of trying to contact them and set something up. Has anybody gotten a chance to look at any of the Flutter Europe talks that have been posted online?
Unfortunately, no. I was supposed to go to an event, but I ended up having to basically go back home because something came up. So no, I wish I had more information. So I'm happy to be here, though.
Yeah, so I was actually, 1 second, I can share my screen. So I've actually watched like 3 talks up until now. You should be able to see my screen. And I've basically just gone through and like added my notes for each talk. And then I'm also trying to add time links for each of these notes as well. Just kind of going through all the important information for me in particular. The 3 talks I watched so far were Implementing Complex UI, which is by, I forget the name of the guy, I think it's Martin or Marcin or something like that, but he basically goes through and looks at like different design challenges that designers have posted on various sites. And then he'll post a YouTube video of him trying to solve that in using Flutter. So it's really interesting because he basically breaks down how he solves probably 90% of his problems just using stack transform and the animation controller in some regard. And then he walks through like 4 different designs that he uses those three classes to basically build those designs. So it's actually really neat. The other one, the one that I was actually waiting to be posted online was on navigations. So this was by Simon Lightfoot, and it's basically just talks about like best practices of doing like app navigation, sub-navigation, how you would do routing with parameters and things of that nature. I actually implemented it on, share. Of course, I don't have it open. New share. All right. So one of the easy things that I implemented on my on one of the current applications I was developing is, instead of having the boilerplate code of wiring up navigations everywhere, where you have this material page route, and you're just using that, you're calling that directly every time you do navigation. You actually define that on your page level routes, and then you're going to call that wherever you actually do your navigation. So it simplifies the process where you don't need to know, you no longer, if a new developer is saying, hey, what parameters do I need to route to this page? And you just add them on your page level route defined here, rather than having to worry about actually inspecting the class or something like that, or inspecting the controller. It just gets rid of a little bit of boilerplate. And I can see, where's an example of me? Yeah, so here's an example where you'd call it, you're basically calling it the same, but you get rid of all that boilerplate that you had before. So that was one of the nice things that he added. And he also shows, his recommendation is to use unnamed routes rather than named routes, just because they're easier to work with. I am interested in seeing how that changes with if you're building like a web app with Flutter, because then it's a little bit different because those named routes matter because they'll show up in like your URL. But he goes through and basically explains like how you can use the same pattern to do things like deep linking back to your application, how you can pass parameters. And he also shows like, even if you go the named route, you can still enforce some type safety if you use this same pattern going that route. So that was probably the most beneficial talk that I've only watched 3 talks, but out of the 3, that was the one that I got the most out of. And then the last one that I don't have any notes for yet is a talk by Remy that he basically goes through provider. It's kind of like an intro to provider level talk, but it is useful just for getting a good understanding of how he uses it, why he chose to build provider, and why he made the design decisions, like how he built provider. And I think he has mentioned on Twitter that he's planning on posting like an article series where he talks about like how he uses provider. So that'll probably be the next big thing that I'm looking forward to seeing, just to see like the gaps and the differences between like how I use provider currently and how the creator of provider uses provider. Be interesting. As far as the notes go, I will probably like, once I've gone through all the talks, let me go back to my notes. Once I've gone through all the talks and kind of like organized everything, I'll probably post these notes somewhere and share it out to the group. So I'll share it out on the Slack channel, just so you can kind of have like a full diagram of everything that I kind of went through. I think that's it as far as like updates that I had.
That's great.
Is there anything, anybody, any sort of Q&A, like any problems that people have had over the last couple of weeks?
This isn't related to that. I unfortunately have to drop because something just came up. So I'm sorry, but hopefully I'll be able to catch the next one.
Yeah, no worries.
It's cool, no problem.
Thanks for being here.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Stay
appreciate it.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Stay safe, by the way.
Next time. Yeah, thanks.
Sure.
All right.
I hope you're going to a different room, Ian, in the house.
What's that?
I hope you're leaving to go to a different room in the house or stay in there on the computer. Sorry, didn't mean to stop you.
No, you're good. All right. Thanks, everyone.
Take care. One thing I would say, since, let me see if I can share my screen. Oh, I guess I cannot.
I think I stopped sharing. You should be able to now.
And I will share this one. One thing I would say in this era where everybody is stuck at home, and one where that hits me in a very interesting way. This came out since, and this has really been over the last few days. This is a worldwide Google Doc, basically wiki document that has a huge number, so that's at least 90 people that are on this right now. It looks like they've been hitting most of or getting pushing Google Docs to its limit, at least in terms of like information and things along those lines, and tracking a large part in terms of like the technical opportunities that you can have as a response to the fact that everybody is stuck in their own home. There's a lot of info that's more relevant to the medical care and things like that, and each of these essentially, like if you click on this, it'll open up its own essentially open wiki Google Doc. And the way each one of these is done is you just basically make a comment and then you provide whatever resources are available. I think that given how everybody is staying in place and doing an aspect of social distancing, as technical people, and specifically technical people that are interested in Flutter, this would be a really nice opportunity for us to potentially harness some open source activities that may potentially help those of us that are also here on the front lines. I am all ears in terms of thoughts, at least in that regard, but since my life is in both realms, certainly I'm happy to work on things that could help us more as a community, and especially given this era, doing that in a manner that's open source that others can build with. Flutter gives you speed, and one option that we have now is certainly a lot more time on your all's ends.
That's awesome. I did not know this existed.
Yeah.
I have already shared it with my wife, who is a public health nurse, and she has been in the command center all week.
Yeah, and I've been
triaging.
working. We've set up incident command and things along those lines, and it's been an interesting way to see how so many people that are in a global community have harnessed some of the better aspects of social media and discussions with each other as we're trying to gain more information about what's there. At least from a Flutter perspective, starting with some wireframes, building something out, keeping it open sourced on GitHub or GitLab or take your pick. I think that might actually be good if you guys have the time. If you're working on other stuff, it's a different story. But I'm all ears, at least in terms of that regard.
So what's your idea in terms of like what you could see us building or see members building?
So there's a few things that are happening right now. One is more down the AI, and I'll share my screen again once I find the relevant link. Give me just 1 second. Let me just there was a recent call for participation that's based on AI based activities. And that was actually from the White House. Here we go. And share. This one. So I've been working with some people that are based in Texas that are also working on some of this, but there's now an open source research data set that has most of the literature that's available to us. Available via web. This is the website that you can actually go to that, and I'll link this in the Slack as well. And there's large groups that are looking at making things that are either patient-facing or provider-facing. And when you think about, the reason why I'd mentioned that handbook at the start is that handbook is available as something that, it hits some of the different aspects of, all of us are impacted by this, by this pandemic, but each of us has different strengths. And what that handbook was taking the perspective of was for some people that are there for clinical care, of course, but those that are more from an epidemiologic perspective, like what's there in front of us, and those that are, how can you make the use of doing the work that's, doing your own work for your job while you're at home. My focus has always been, to a large extent, trying to make that data available to providers as cleanly as possible. This is one thing that some people I know are clearly working on because of the call that's already been available. But then, provider-facing tools would be really, really helpful. I can share some of the stuff that had been announced in terms of for like patient-facing, if there's, a nice way that you can access this, the availability for testing nearby, certainly that would be helpful. I know that Google is trying to do some aspects of testing that in the SF region, and that may be a little bit larger than that we can chew, at least here in the Charlotte area. But those are the three thoughts I've got. I'd say probably a little more on the provider-facing side, just in terms of the organization that I'm a part of with ASAP is already interested in this stuff. And yeah, I mean, I can keep you guys posted as terms of like what that could actually entail. I just really right now it's more of a call for, are you guys twiddling your thumbs or hammering away at things that are mostly Flutter related? And if you're twiddling your thumbs, we'd love some help. We absolutely would. So, yeah. While we're chatting, or certainly before the next time we meet, I'll share. I wanted to share the stuff that I had been working on for the larger organizations to see if they're interested in that, and then if they are, just pushing some of that stuff out. But yeah, those are some of the very basic thoughts that I've got, at least in terms of what people have been asking for on our end. But starting with, even you think about that tech handbook, that really was, that's just a Google Docs that you can access. So even, you think about like taking some of that and putting it in a manner that you can more easily get to while you're on shift. That might be helpful, especially given how, if I load the section that's available for doctors, it kind of doesn't completely crash the server, but this is what you see. Some of the tools might be unavailable during heavy traffic in this file. Try again.
Yep.
And I've noticed that, and if you keep the website open for a while, just because so many people are harnessing this, it's only been out a few days. But since so many people are harnessing this, maybe can we find a better way for you to get access to some of this stuff, like on your phone or as a Flutter-based app? And that might be, especially, there is no way I'll be able to put together all of the information that is here. There's no way I can curate all of that. But the fact that it's done in a wiki format is really, really helpful. And so if we can find a nice, quick way that I can just see this or decide which of these aspects I want to save or favorite or things along those lines, so I can look this up when I'm not stuck in terms of heavy traffic, maybe just some offline caching or something along those lines. Those are some just quick thoughts that I've had as I've been dealing with what that fallout is anyways. But yeah, any suggestions, happily, by all means, fingers crossed, thumbs up.
I like the idea of empowering somebody with a mobile phone to be able to be able to have that easily accessible, and even though you could pull up a Google Doc on a phone, if it's already having connectivity issues and or isn't responsive, it is responsive, but you could have a little more flexibility with a Flutter app possibly to just lay out things so that it's the user experience. Because I feel like people like you're describing, like yourself and others that need it quickly, they also don't need to fumble around with hard to navigate items. You just want to get to the data you need pretty quickly.
Yeah, agree. And this whole thing, the fact that it's built on docs, that would be really helpful for us. I think that would be really, really useful as we're, all countries are dealing with this. And when you're on shift, you only have so much access to whatever tech is there, and also the infection risks and everything like that. So of course you're going to be cleaning your phone and sterilizing everything that you touch. But yeah, if you can't load the site, it's not that helpful. This as a tool that's only been out for a very short time, I imagine that's a good problem to have, but not if you're the one that's actually having that problem. So yeah, any thoughts? Happily welcomed.
That's great. I am definitely not twiddling my thumbs. We're actually unfortunately not doing Flutter for this, but we're getting pulled into some municipalities to get their COVID sites up and make them better and withstand traffic, same kinds of things. So it is related and interesting conversations. That most of the documentation that we've seen is more of public consumption type content. So this is great to see some of this.
Yeah, because that's
I don't
there.
understand all this because I'm not a doctor or medical professional, but it's still great to have access to more of this depth.
Yeah, that site is targeted towards experts, but experts of all the various fields. And there's public-facing stuff as well as you're working on reaching out. That was featured on BBC World Service last night, by the way.
Oh, great.
Yeah, so, yeah.
Hi, guys. I've been listening. Sorry, I'm making dinner, so I have my camera off. But
No worries.
I was at the last Flutter meetup. I am actually a React dev mostly, but I am on the bench right now, and I'm a consultant. I have lots of time. I think I could make a cutover if you just want to start sending me tasks. I'll take a little bit of ramping up time, but I'd love to help on something like this.
Yeah, no, that'd be great. I am working clinically this evening overnight, and I will make sure that I send at least some of the stuff before that starts. But I'm going to keep this in the Charlotte Dev Slack and just keep mentioning, and we set up a repository, we keep it open source, and we'll throw some probably maybe some open source wireframes together on Figma, since that's also a nice online collaborative means that you can work on some of this stuff.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
I'd love to help.
Okay. Cool. Thank you, Katie.
Yeah, I'm on the Flutter channel too on Charlotte Dev, so I should be able to see whatever you put out there.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks for your help on that, Katie. That's awesome.
Yeah, no problem. Gonna go back to turn off the video,
Okay.
making dinner, but I'm listening.
I'm eating dinner. I'll put it in the chat, but I did want to say I am not eating Pizza Hut or Papa John's right now. It's a home cooked meal,
That's fine.
so it's a little different for Flutter Meetup.
Tragedy.
Yeah.
Let's see. Not sure what else I have, at least in terms of what's been done on the Flutter side. At least we're sharing yet. I mean, we had for Katie, I think, not sure if you had seen this, but we actually gave I have a lecture series that links Flutter to Firebase as live coded in 2 hours. And that's going to be on the same YouTube channel. It was a 2-hour lecture. And I think that was the hardest live coding I've ever done, but covered a lot of stuff, at least in terms of basic layouts and things along those lines, tackled from a little bit more of an intermediate perspective. Yeah, that model of the putting things in various folders for screen, services, and shared is one that I'll probably suggest following in whatever project we tackle in this regard. Yeah, I will keep that stuff shared out.
Great, that'd be awesome.
So our internal Flutter project at work that I mentioned a few times, we now have a UX designer on task. So Bio and I onboarded her this week, and she's real excited about it. So this will be our first. Ryan and Eric both remember, probably Eric's not on tonight, doesn't look like, but remember me asking, like, how do you work with designers, and what's some approaches, and how do you deal with those times when you have to answer back and say, well, we can't really do that with Flutter easily, and some of that could be like our experience with Flutter, right? Too, that there's a gap for me in the team, but we're diving into that, so I'm kind of excited to see where that goes, and also trying to keep our team who are working on the React version of that with a heads up that in someday that could be a Flutter for web version of that app, because it might make sense, but keep them motivated while knowing that just prep that, hey, code can get ripped away just because you write it. It's not sacred. So some of that's going on. It's kind of exciting to see how that progresses, and we've got some more folks that are interested in Flutter that have started. And one of our lead architects who's really smart, and I think will poke holes into all of my optimism about Flutter. I've onboarded him, and I'm real excited because I want him to poke the holes and challenge me. So you may see questions that are from some of that hit our channels and stuff. So
Okay.
Also, I think Mark, you had asked about the source code from the presentation, and I posted that link in the Slack channel.
Oh, cool. Thank you.
Yeah.
It was real simple, but it's such a simple, if it's open source, it was such a great demo for your talk.
Yeah, and I wanted to keep it as simple as I possibly could. I did make some slight changes. Let me see if I have it up here. Is that the right one? No, that's not the right one. All right. Yeah, I made some slight changes to it where the project structure, just to, instead of having everything in the one file like I had before, that's not really a good practice. So I broke it up into what is kind of like the traditional sort of folder structure where we have our model services and our UI. And then we only have one page, which is that home page. And then there's some shared widgets there as well. And this is kind of the approach that I've been taking with most of my Flutter projects. What's interesting is for work, we're starting to build more integrations in the application where it's actually morphing to where it has multiple features, almost like mini applications all rolled into one. So this structure probably won't work for that, like long term, where we'll probably have to break it up to more like a feature-based folder structure. But that's a very rare case compared to what we have here. So I'm interested to see what that looks like and what the design is going to change drastically, because we basically have an app that launches like different apps inside of it, kind of like if you use like the Geico application, or if you use the new Office application, you have all those applications that are kind of just like rolled into one. So there's some interesting problems to solve there. There was also some pieces that I wanted to change just to like take this simple example and make it more productionized. So like things like if you look at the models, like I'm basically handwriting my from JSON. I don't have like a loading. I don't have like different states like I have in other applications that I've shown in the past. So compare that to like a production app that we have here. Let me close all these. Where you have a similar structure, but like I have repositories, I have an actual view model. Whereas in the previous example, it's just all kind of wired up directly in the UI. So there are some things that I want to improve upon and refactor to get it to a nicer place where it's something that somebody could actually look at when they're building applications rather than something you just use for like hello world purposes.
Are you keeping it where you have a single stateless widget within each file, within each Dart file?
Yeah.
Okay.
So that's not a hard rule for me. It's more you expose a single stateless widget or single widget from each Dart file. So like you might have a widget, like a page widget, and there's a good example for this. If we go to UI. I broke everything. Sweet. All right, so if we go to this values page, it's a little bigger than it needs to be, but you can see here I have some like private widgets.
Yeah.
The reason why I keep them in here versus breaking them out is because they're only ever going to be used for this particular widget. Like in this case, I'm just implementing a search, and that search requires you to have like a results list and a suggestions list. Suggestions are displayed as the user types. Results are displayed when the user actually picks one of the results from the suggestions. And there's no case where I'm ever going to use that widget outside of those two widgets outside of the search widget. So it makes sense to just keep them closely aligned unless the file becomes untenable. So in this case, if you just look at like the search code, it's around about 200 lines of code. Probably doesn't make sense to like break that out into like separate widgets. unless you feel like you need to test like those particular widgets themselves. Like if I needed to test the results card and test the suggestions card separately, in this case I don't, because they're just dumb widgets. I can test them as part of testing like the search results, basically, if that makes sense.
Okay.
So what you were just saying about having the excuses app as an example, that's fantastic, because that was really my use case. I didn't really explain why I wanted it as much, but as developers, we can continuously double guess ourselves on things that probably we shouldn't waste our time on instead of building things. But it's still nice to have, somebody like you that's vetted patterns, and John too, that patterns have been vetted and these work, even though you can arrange. The Flutter being so flexible, I guess, is part of the problem with that. Like there's, when you would start a Ruby on Rails app, it defines so much about where you put things. And this is kind of like, hey, you go into lib and you kind of organize it wherever you want. So yeah, that's super helpful. But also just to share like an app that I feel trust in for others starting out with Flutter to take a look at and get up and running. I think it's useful for that as well. But there are some really good Flutter examples. I think even the Flutter repo, the actual Flutter on GitHub, there's some example apps, but they're sort of all over the map. They're good, but they're, they range in complexity and purpose. So.
Yeah, exactly. And actually, if y'all would like, we could do like live coding right here and sort of like walk through one of the changes that I would probably make to this code.
Oh, fantastic.
Be interesting for you. All right, so the thing, this is a pretty easy one because I've done it like 5 million times. Basically, we're going to implement like our loading states. So our error, our loading, our success, and our empty states. Really, the only two states in this case that we care about are success, loading, and error, because we know we're never going to have an empty list since this is a statically generated list, but it'll still be a good practice. And for an example, we can take a look at, where's that core? Models, repository states, model states. So this is an example of what we're going to implement, where we basically, if you're not familiar with the sealed class, it's a Kotlin term. It basically means you can enforce a class hierarchy to where you have like an abstract type, and then you have these actual implementation classes. And when you do a sealed union, you have to enforce that all of these are used. So this would be an alternative to doing like a switch statement. And to show you an example of where this is implemented, if I can find one. Let's see if I can find a better one. Yeah, this is a good one. All right, so if you look at like normal implementations of block, you'll basically see a switch statement where you're saying if success, do this, if error, do this, or render this, if loading, render this. Sealed unions, the difference here is that sealed unions, you're enforcing sort of hard rules rather than soft conventions. So if I were to say add a new state, let's say we didn't have empty before, and you added like an empty state for your switch statement, how do you know for sure that that has been implemented everywhere that you're supposed to handle it? You don't really know that for sure. In the case where you're using a sealed union, it'll actually give you an error or a warning whenever one of those states isn't handled correctly. So here you can see, hey, it's basically arguing, or it's basically barking at us because the empty function has not been handled, or the empty parameter has not been passed into this when statement. And that's just because we commented out this one here. So I like that because you actually get an error versus if you're doing a switch statement, you don't get an error. So like if somebody else were looking at this code and trying to figure out what did I do wrong, why is the correct state not showing, or why am I getting an error at runtime, you would easily be able to look at your tooling and see, oh, okay, it's because I didn't implement the empty handler where I was supposed to. So like the practice here is we're just going to go through and kind of implement this, and I just walk through and like implementing this and then wiring it up with the provider, just to like keep it as straightforward as possible. So we're going to go to our previous example, and I've already added we're going to go to excuses. I've already added the dependencies that we need. So we're using this library called freezed. So there's two parts to it. There's the freezed, which is like the runtime builder part. And then there's freezed annotation, which is the actual decorator that we're going to use when we wire this thing up. So let's just go do model state. You can see we get a whole bunch of like nasty errors, out of the gate. This is because we haven't actually ran the builder that's going to automatically generate the files that are necessary here. So if you've never played with the builder before, or you've never seen like how this works, there's a good section on Flutter. I just lost everything. Open up another window. If you go on to flutter.dev, there's a section on JSON serialization that basically walks you through how to use the build runner. And that basically explains kind of what we're going to be doing here.
I have it linked in the chat.
Yeah,
you got
it. There we go. Yeah. But this basically walks you through a simple example where you're just doing all of your serialization manually, and then it shows you how you can do it using builders. Builders are basically just like Webpack or Webpack Gulp or something. It's basically just a build process that runs similar to Webpack and generates some stuff for you. So let's see, we copied and pasted this, so hopefully it'll just work when I run the build. And when we also have a secondary dependency called, we should have a secondary dependency.
I don't want to sidetrack. Real quick question. I noticed you had a split screen terminal. First, I thought it was tmux in there, but it looks like I don't think I've ever tried that with VS Code. You open two terminals and just split them.
Yeah, you just it's this split right here,
Okay.
split terminal right here. Yeah.
I have not tried that there. I'm just so used to the tmux stuff, but that's great.
And you can also you can have multiple terminals as well. So if you didn't want to split this, if you wanted to have like another page, you can do that as well.
Yeah, I feel like I've done that before, but the split was great.
Yep.
Cool.
All right, so we also need this build runner dependency. And I think eventually this dependency will be baked directly into the Flutter CLI command. So you shouldn't need this. I think it's in master right now. I think the next major release, you shouldn't need this anymore. It should automatically run the build runner as part of like your Flutter run step as well, which is really nice. That dependency, and then something like Flutter run build runner build. And the two commands that you care about when you're running the build runner are build and watch. Build is just going to run the build once, and watch is going to just continuously set up like a listener to look and see if your files have changed and continue to run it. The only reason you might want to run watch is if you're changing files a lot. Running build runner individually can take a decent chunk of time. Like in this case, it'll probably take about it took about 14 seconds compared to if we were running the build runner watch command, it would be maybe a second. So there are some dev cycles saved there. So you can see like all of our errors went away. If we open up this file that was generated, this freeze file here, you can basically see all of the implementations, the actual implementation of those classes that we're using here. So basically, let's just walk through what this means. Like, this is a convention of the Freeze library where you're going to define your sealed class as an abstract class. In this case, we're using generics because we're saying we want to be able to define different. We want to be able to use this class with different types of models. So if you didn't have just one model, in this case, we only have the excuses model. So we could just hard code this, and we could do something like abstract class state with state. We could do something like this to accomplish basically the same thing because we only care about one class. But in this case, let's say we wanted to add like a user or added like the ability to favorite or have a watch list of some sort, then we potentially want to reuse this functionality everywhere. So that's why we're going to define this using generics. But walking through, these are basically all the states that we care about and that we want to enforce in our view code. So success, if the request has successfully retrieved the information, loading, if the request is pending, empty, if we've retrieved our information but there's nothing there, and then error, obviously, if the request errored out for some reason. So the next piece, let's see here. We should have our excuses service. That's basically just going to get our excuses list. The next piece we want, so technically, all right, so I've defined the repositories and a view models folder. Repositories, in the case of the application that I'm working on now, the repository basically takes an async function and maps the model to the state. And then the view model basically exposes that the stream for that thing. So we're going to define let's just call it home. And then there's normally a one-to-one mapping between the repository and the model. So this is going to be excuse. And then let's see, we wanted that class. Then we want to say get excuses. This is going to be a string. Here, what we need the excuse service. So we're going to do our excuse. Let's see, what's my error here?
It's a list.
Yeah, there we go. And then we actually don't want to return that list that we get back. We want to return the model state list. What we're going to do is we're going to convert that list that we get back to that success object. So we're going to do let's see here, it's results. Oops. And then it's going to be model state dot success results. Sweet. And then we also want to say for the initial load, should I do that here? Yeah, I'll do it here. So we can also define like our initial load. So I'm not using. Okay, sorry, I'm not using argstart. And then finally, we want to handle the error. Let's see, what was the error function on error return? That sounds right. Let me look and see. Error. All right, so it's on error return. And then it'd also be good to see if we check to see if this was empty and displayed empty if it is. So let's say results empty is empty. Empty, otherwise, all right. So just to walk through what we built here, we fetch our excuses, we convert that to a stream, and then if the stream successfully queries, we're going to map the results to empty or success depending on whether or not, or we're going to map the state to empty or success depending on whether the results are empty. We said that we want to start with a loading state. And then finally, if we have an error, we want to map that with our error state. So now we're going to build our view model. Yeah, we already got one. Let's see, what do we need? We need a get uses. And this is going to be stream void. Uses listen from data. And so we've defined this get excuses function. That's basically just going to call our get excuses from the repository. And then we also want to define a stream to add our results to. And then we want to define a value stream that's going to return those results. And the reason that we have two streams is the value stream can't be edited. So it ensures that if a user subscribes to get excuses, they can't, or if a developer subscribes to get excuses, they can't come in and edit it in an incorrect way. It basically enforces that you have to call the API we've defined to make edits, rather than making edits right then and there and potentially getting the application in a bad state. So we're going to create a behavior subject. I'm going to call it model state list excuses. I'm going to call it excuse. Double check my code. Just call it like that. Yeah, looks better. So then we'll expose our stream. This is going to be private. And we'll expose the public one. Something like all right. The getter. Oops. Yeah, it's a getter. Make sure that's right. Stream, that's what we want, not value. And just to be a good citizen, we'll define, see, this is going to be a value stream.
Singular. Yeah.
All right. And then for the final step, when we listen, we basically just want to add to this stream here. And if you've never seen that $ before, that's just like a convention for letting a developer know that something is a stream versus like a regular variable. So you just $ on top of whatever it is. And then we're going to add data. Yeah. Let's see, so oh yeah, stream subscription. Right. And then our final step is how do we actually wire this thing up to the UI? So we're going to use provider here. We're going to define, we're going to do it on top of material app. Multi-provider. It is and child. Child. This looks right. Yeah, we'll run it and see what happens. So let's run this and see what happens. So for the last step, we basically defined a multi-provider because we're going to pass in our home view model to be able to be used later to actually call that get excuses function. And then we're going to expose that stream that we care about directly using the stream provider. So this is an interesting, not well-documented feature of a provider. Basically, inside of where you define your providers, you can create a consumer and subscribe to changes for a thing, and then you can return another provider based off of changes to that thing. You can also use the proxy provider as well. I prefer the consumer API. I can't remember why I chose to use the consumer API in some cases versus the proxy provider, but I've gone to just using the consumer in almost every case rather than proxy provider. So at the end of this, we're subscribing to the home view model. Once we have the home view model, we are creating a stream provider with that excuses stream that we created. And the reason that you'll do this versus just subscribing directly to the stream and using Stream Builder is because Stream Provider encapsulates some of the connection loading states that you have to capture outside of the state. Basically, all of the stream state that isn't captured in your thing is handled inside a Stream Provider versus in Stream Builder, you have to check for all these different states aside from the states that we actually care about. So the end result, we go into, let's just run it our clicks to see if we get any errors. And we got some errors. What did I do? I think I know what I did. I forgot some code. That's what I need. Oh, no. Again, I'm just going to go to history. So now we should run it. If we've we should run it and get no errors. Sweet, we got no errors. All right, and then finally, we want to swap out how we're currently getting our excuses with sort of the new hotness way of getting our excuses. So we're going to go to the home page. And let's see, we should be using a feature builder of some sort here. Oh, we're not. We're just binding directly to the state. All right. So we're going to get rid of this stuff. Instead, what we actually want to do see. No. Then we're going to say error here. That looks right. Oh. Always one more. Then,
You're doing well from memory mostly. I mean,
Yeah, I agree.
so loading, we want to return loading. Top. All right, so let's see what happens when we run this. So I'll take you through like each of the things that we added. Basically, we swapped out the code that we had where we were retrieving our excuses to actually call the home view model to get the excuses. And then since we're exposing that stream to excuses, we can directly consume it here rather than having to do something like if we were just using the stream from view model, we'd have to do something like return stream builder. And we have to pass it in the stream, and it would be, we'd have to get home view model, pass it in, view out excuses stream, and then we'd have to pass it on builder. That's X snap, I think. And then we'd have to like handle the state where snap dot, let's see, we'd have to handle like our connection state. We'd have to handle error, handle our error. So we'd have to handle all of these states that are built in by default that we don't have to handle if we just use stream provider. On top of having to like subscribe to the stream from home view model. Whereas here we can just say, hey, this is the thing I care about, give it to me. So it definitely simplifies code there. And then there's, if we were trying to add some default ways of handling all that, handling like connection state or handling that error state, you can do that where you actually define stream provider. So we could use like a error, catch error, state dot error. We could do that here. We could also that's weird. Huh, that's weird. Resume share. Can y'all still see my screen?
Yep.
Yep.
And it paused for some reason. Let me stop and reshare. Something happened. All right. What's that error I'm getting? What? Oh, there we go. All right. Did I define that? Ah, okay. That's what I'm missing. All right. I'm not gonna worry about that. But basically, you could define like high-level sort of handlers where we could define that initial data and that catch error here as well, rather than having them defined inside of our repository. Let's go back to home and let's run it and let's see if it breaks. It did. When was called on a null. My favorite. Add that here and then rerun. Model state dynamic is not a subtype of stream model state. Let's see, what am I missing here? Something I haven't defined the type correctly on something. Results, no, results should be model state empty. Success is correct. Loading is dynamic. All right, so if I go back to my example. That's annoying.
Command tilde is
What'd
your
you say?
shortcut. Command and then tilde is the keyboard shortcut to switch between two windows within code or within Chrome or anything.
Command and tilde?
Yeah, or whatever is to the left of the one. Or if you do 3 finger swipe down, that'll also show.
There we go.
Yeah.
Turn with, oh, I see. Oh no, it's still giving me shit. Get rid of this one. They're both hosed. All right. I'll just hard code this one. And go. So should see it handling all of our states correctly. Let's just say we're going to pass in empty just to like test that empty works. So I'm just going to invert this. It's not empty. All right, see, we get no results or, error. Something went horribly wrong. So you can see now we should be correctly handling like every single state that we have, every single potential state that we could have for the application, using that freeze library. And then also you've seen how we can wire up a provider basically start to finish, changing from managing all of your state, managing your API calls actually inside of your widget tree versus managing them outside using provider, using sort of the repository model pattern as well. some things, some pieces like the bootstrapping piece, some differences between how I've done that here versus how I do it in my actual application is instead of defining that in main, I'd have like a bootstrap widget, and that bootstrap could have all of my dependencies. The reason why you're going to do that is because if you're building like any sort of non-trivial application, that bootstrap can fill up pretty quickly, especially when you're talking about like we have multiple stream. In this case, we have like basically a stream provider for almost every page. So like watch list, we have different types like vehicle summary, auctions, all that. As you start to add more and more dependencies, it can get huge, and you don't want to have that all in your main file. So Bootstrap would be just like your service locator if you're using Git. Get it, I think it's called.
Let's get it.
And then one of the things that you'll notice that's sort of advanced compared to how we're using it is you can also define a multi-provider inside of where you're defining your consumers. So before I had like multiple consumers on home view model, and for each one I was creating these streams. And then like I decided that I didn't hate myself anymore, and I was just gonna use like one multi-provider and pass all of these streams based off of that one view model there. So you can get as funky as you want with how you bootstrap your application using provider. One piece that's different here versus there is you can see inside of my view model, inside of my excuses repository, I'm basically like hard coding this this dependency to get excuses. So in this case, I'm hard coding my excuses repository. You wouldn't really want to do that for testability's sake. You'd actually want to either pass in that dependency, or you'd want to pass in like a locator function for that dependency. And in the application I'm working on, I actually have this make locator function here that's just a helper function that's going to allow you to pass in and use provider to get all of your dependencies in sort of a read-only mode. So if you were to look at this make locator function, all it does is call context with the dependency that you want to retrieve and say that listen is false, so that you're not subscribing to changes. And then like, let's see, I think it's locate. Yeah, so let's see if I can find a simpler example. Here's a good one. All right, so here we have a favorites repository. You can basically see I'm passing in that locator function, so I'm expecting it, and then how you would use it is either inside of your function or as you're defining all of your dependencies, you can basically just say, hey, go get me the favorites client, and I'm going to use that to make my calls. So if you wanted to set this up in a way that's testable, you'd go with this pattern versus going with the pattern of just instantiating all of your dependencies directly in the class. I prefer using, there's nothing wrong with using provider and get it together, or just using, if you want to use get it and not use provider for your dependencies. I like using provider because I adhere to the idea of everything sort of being a widget. And if you're, so in my case, we're doing some interesting things for Insider where you change your environment directly in the application. And the nice thing about using provider to do that is basically it's just we have a provider that based off of changes to that particular provider, it will reload the entire application. You don't have to do any extraneous stuff because all of these providers are just widgets. By default, it's just going to rebuild your widget tree whenever that configuration changes. So like if I were to change from dev to QA to prod, that's basically just me changing a flag that I'm subscribing to, and it'll reload the config and rebuild the application based off of that change. So you can do funkier things in my mind easier. Like you can do complex things a lot easier if you adhere to that everything is a widget sort of provider pattern versus trying to mix and match provider with get it. if that makes sense.
Can I share my screen, Ryan?
Yeah, sure.
Cool. I'm hitting a bit of a, or I'm getting near to the end of the time that I have available. Here, let me put this over here. First, this is wonderful. Can you see my screen right now? You see it?
Looks good.
Yeah. Okay, cool. Very, very good job. I'm curious if this is something that's available for all. Can you publish that as the changes that you made as a branch so that we could actually see the difference between what you had done with your original versus what it is now?
Yep. Yeah.
And whenever I'm back at a computer, I'll be happy to share some of this stuff. What you've done with error handling of streams reminds me a lot, and it's been, oh God, 8 months since I've actually looked at this. I know it did get updated recently by Flutter community dev, but Thomas Burkhart's the guy who did get it, also had worked on something for error handling of streams called RX Command. And he had that as part of his RxVMS model, where he actually had a builder for data and for the placeholder and for error. And so I haven't gone in depth in this, but it looks like it's gotten updated to what's the newer versions today. So when you're thinking about, are you going to do this within harnessing provider or the model that you've posted, or one where you're doing probably a little bit more heavy-handed work with get it and the various streams. One final option is from Fireship's Firebase Quiz Apps course. If you go inside of the lib folder and in their services, you go to, I think it's database. They use a global as the primary. So everything, your data models are accessed through the global reference. And then it will, essentially it's an abstraction as to whether or not you're doing for Firebase as a document or a collection or things along those lines. It doesn't have the same error handling, so I don't think it's as robust as the thing you showed, and probably also by comparison for RX Command. Though I haven't seen something as robust as what you've done thus far, which is really good. But oh my God, that needs to be turned into a pub package so that we don't have to redo that over and over and over and over again. Because I think that would certainly help. I've been accumulating tabs here. I hope you don't mind. Leading back to one other aspect, I'm going to show something that I had mentioned, just to kind of give a little bit of a thought as to what this could turn into. Actually, where was this at? And yeah, this was really good. I enjoyed the code session. It certainly is very, very helpful.
It was awesome.
Yeah.
So I had a quick, this is maybe a ridiculous question, but RxDart, which you're using in there, is it possible to take, so is it possible, you may have said this, so I'm just going to say it, whether I'm dumb or not. Is it possible to use RxDart to create a stream in the app for what truly is not streamable, not a WebSocket, is just an API, like a RESTful API sitting out there, but turn it into a stream as far as the app sees? Can it do that? Or
so do you mean taking a REST call and converting it into a stream with polling, or just converting it for the sake of one call?
Probably for polling, as for something changing.
Yeah, so I don't remember. Let me go back to my screen. So I don't remember the exact call to do that. Wait. I think it's something like timer stream. Yeah, that sounds right.
There is a timer stream, yeah.
And I think you pass it in like a duration. Oh, show me the. Let's see here.
It
Yeah,
is.
so you can pass it in a duration, and basically that would set up your sort of polling there.
Yeah. And,
I think one of the shortcomings of like the stream library, or not the stream library, sorry, of the HTTP library and DO library is that they don't expose like streams by default, rather than exposing like futures and promises, or futures or promises, same thing. And that's just me coming from doing a little bit of Angular development, where the Angular HTTP library is everything is streams by default, not futures. So it like makes for a much more robust capabilities that you don't have to build yourself using like third-party libraries. But you should just be able to use like create a timer stream and pass in the thing that you want to query on that timer interval.
Yeah, agree. And
Yeah,
on that
great.
note, I'm going to have to duck out. Thank you so much for setting this up, Ryan.
Right. Yeah, no problem. Next meeting, we can talk maybe a little bit more about how we take some of these pieces and test them out, and maybe add some routing as well. Or if you have any other questions about things that you want to add to this example, just let me know, and I can start like getting together like how I would refactor this example. And then like whenever you have that the recording of this session up, like just post it out or share it or whatever.
Yeah. All right.
Channel, that'd be great.
Will do.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Thanks for doing that.
Yeah, of course.
All right,
Right.
guys.
Cool.
Take care.
See everybody later.
See you.